The vanishing lights. The town of Cold Hollow was the kind of place most people passed through without remembering. A thin ribbon of asphalt cut through pine forests and sagging power lines, carrying locals from one forgotten town to another. But in the fall of 1998, it became the setting of something people whispered about for years, a night that stitched itself into the bones of everyone who lived there. The power outages had started small, quick blackouts that lasted no more than a few seconds, just long enough for televisions to go silent and lamps to flicker. But when the electricity didn't come back one Friday night, the town found itself plunged into an eerie quiet, save for the crackling of old generators and the shriek of crickets in the trees. For residents, it should have been nothing more than an inconvenience. Families gathered around candles, some lit fires and fireplaces they hadn't used in decades, and teenagers wandered the darkened streets with flashlights, laughing about ghost stories. Yet, it was different this time. Those who looked out their windows swore the street lamps didn't just shut off, they faded, as though something had drained the light out of them instead of the power simply failing. When Mrs. Halpern, a widow who lived alone near the edge of town, walked out to check her fuse box, she noticed the woods across the street glowing faintly, as if dozens of fireflies were pulsing in sync. But when she squinted, the lights weren't insects. They were too large, too steadied up. By morning, 3 families were gone. No signs of struggle, no packed belongings, just empty houses with half-eaten dinners on the tables and clocks stuck on 9:37 p.m. the moment the blackout began. Sheriff Whitaker tried to keep order, assuring everyone that the missing families might have gone to relatives during the outage. But Cold Hollow was small. Everyone knew everyone else. There were no relatives to visit within driving distance. And even if there had been, who leaves their dinner plates behind in such a rush? Neighbors began locking their doors in broad daylight, whispering to each other about the strange lights in the woods. By the third day, without power, paranoia had settled like a heavy fog. People claimed they could see figures moving between the trees when night fell. Tall, lanky shadows that didn't sway like the pines in the wind, but instead seemed to lean forward, watching the town in silence. A group of teenagers tried to prove it was all hysteria and wandered into the woods with camcorders, hoping to capture footage. Only 2 of them came back, stumbling and incoherent, babbling about faces in the dark. The sheriff found their camera a week later, smashed to pieces and buried under leaves as though someone, or something, had tried to hide it. Cold Hollow was no stranger to strange stories. For generations, people had talked about the Hollow Men, tales whispered during bonfires and sleepovers. Skeptics dismissed them as campfire fabrications, but the blackout gave those old stories teeth. As the days stretched on and the lights never returned, the town became an island of dread, cut off from the outside world by phone lines that buzzed with static and roads that seemed to twist endlessly back into the same streets. Nobody could explain it, but everyone began to feel the same thing. Something was closing in, and the darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive. The things in the pines. The blackout stretched into its 6th night, and the air in Cold Hollow grew heavy with unease. The town square, usually bustling with children on bicycles and elderly folks chatting by the diner, was now eerily vacant. Candles flickered in windows, and the few gasoline generators still working sputtered and hissed as though they too were afraid to continue. Sheriff Whitaker had made it his duty to knock on doors every evening, making sure everyone was still accounted for. But even the sheriff, solid, broad-shouldered, and steady in a crisis, had begun looking over his shoulder a little too often. People whispered that when he drove past the Treeline, he always saw a set of eyes staring back at him in his rearview mirror, and no matter how quickly he turned his car around, nothing was there. A group of townsfolk gathered at the church on Main Street, convinced safety lay in numbers. Father Callahan, who had lived in Cold Hollow for more than 40 years, led them in prayer by lantern light. But he admitted later that the prayers felt muffled, swallowed up by the thick darkness pressing against the stained glass windows. The townsfolk stayed huddled together, murmuring about the missing families, their fear rising when they realized no rescue vehicles, no utility crews, no outside contact of any kind had arrived to help them. It was as if Cold Hollow had been cut out of the world entirely. Even those who tried to drive out swore the roads twisted back on themselves, leading them straight to where they started. Meanwhile, strange noises haunted the nights. Whispers, almost conversational, drifted across the yards as though groups of people were standing just beyond sight, talking softly. Dogs barked frantically, then fell silent as if someone had pressed mute. Children complained of nightmares where long, gray faces peeked through their windows, asking to be let inside. One boy, Danny Reeve, told his mother that the tall men in the trees were waiting for the rest of the town to go to sleep. His mother scolded him, but when she woke the next morning, she found small, muddy footprints leading up to her back porch, far too large to belong to a child. Sheriff Whitaker called a town meeting at the high school gymnasium. Battery-powered lanterns were set up along the bleachers, and nearly the entire population of Cold Hollow squeezed inside, desperate for answers. Whitaker tried to reassure them, claiming it was all a freak storm that had knocked out communications and roads. But when one man shouted that his cousin in the next county hadn't been able to reach him by CB radio, murmurs spread through the crowd. The sheriff looked tired, his voice cracking as he admitted he didn't know what was happening. Then, right as he spoke, every lantern in the gym flickered, not off, but dimming unnaturally, as though something was pulling the light out of them. Gasps echoed through the hall, and Father Callahan began whispering a prayer. The town's fear tipped into panic. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men shouted at the sheriff to do something, and whispers of leaving the town on foot filled the air. But then, the gymnasium's heavy steel doors groaned, slowly opening as a gust of frigid air swept inside. No one was standing there. Outside, across the street, the treeline glowed faintly again. Only this time, the lights weren't stationary. They were moving, slowly, deliberately, toward the gymnasium. And in that instant, every soul in Cold Hollow knew they weren't alone. When the lights moved, the crowd in the gymnasium froze when the pale orbs appeared in the treeline. At first, people clung to the hope that it was some kind of trick, maybe hunters with lanterns or headlights filtering through the woods. But the longer they watched, the less human it all seemed. The orbs didn't sway with the wind or bob with footsteps. They glided, smooth and synchronized, weaving between the trees without ever breaking formation. Sheriff Whitaker drew his revolver, the metal catching a glint from the lantern light, but it looked pitiful against the slow, measured advance. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Father Callahan muttered prayers under his breath, words spilling so fast they tangled on his tongue. Then the orbs blinked out. 1 second they were there, dozens of floating, silvery eyes between the trees, and the next, they were gone, as if someone had blown out a candle. Silence swallowed the gym. The only sound was the sheriff's radio hissing faint static. Relief washed over some, but it didn't last long. A loud metallic clang rang out from the back of the building, followed by a low scraping noise that traveled across the roof. The crowd screamed. Someone shouted that they saw shadows moving along the skylights, tall silhouettes shifting against the faint starlight above. Sheriff Whitaker barked orders for everyone to stay calm, but his voice trembled. The scraping stopped. For a moment, all that remained was the thick, suffocating quiet of fear. Then, with no warning, the emergency exit door at the far side of the gym rattled violently, the metal handle twisting as though someone, or something, was trying to get in. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. The sheriff aimed his gun at the door, sweat dripping down his temple, and shouted for whoever was outside to identify themselves. No voice answered. Only the sound of slow, deliberate knocks followed. 3 sharp raps that echoed like a grim announcement. The children began crying openly now, their wails piercing the heavy air. The door suddenly went still. For a long minute, no one dared to breathe. Then, as though the night itself were mocking them, every lantern in the gym flared brighter before snuffing out completely, plunging the hall into total darkness. Panic erupted. People screamed, stumbling into one another. A glass window shattered near the bleachers, followed by a piercing shriek that didn't sound entirely human. Something long, cold, and heavy brushed past several townsfolk in the dark, leaving behind a rancid smell of wet earth and rot. In the chaos, the sheriff fired his revolver blindly. The flash illuminated a figure for the briefest of moments, impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling beams, with skin that seemed more shadow than flesh. And then the light vanished again, leaving only the echo of his gunshot. By the time the lanterns flickered back to life, half the gym was empty. Entire families were gone, vanished in the dark as though they had never been there at all. The doors and windows remained locked, unbroken, as though nothing had left or entered. Yet on the gym floor, where the missing townsfolk had once sat, damp footprints stretched across the hardwood, leading nowhere. The smell of soil and pine clung to the air, stronger now, as though the forest itself had seeped into the heart of Cold Hollow. Ashes in the dark, the survivors huddled together in the gymnasium long after the echoes of the gunshots faded. The lanterns sputtered weakly, their glow making the pale faces of the townsfolk look ghost-like. Nearly 40 people had been inside when the lights went out. Now, less than 20 remained. Empty shoes, fallen coats, and even a doll lay scattered across the bleachers, mute evidence of those who had vanished. No broken doors, no shattered locks, no footprints leading out. Just sudden, unnatural absence. It was Father Callahan who broke the silence, his voice shaking as he whispered, "They were taken." Sheriff Whitaker tried to regain control. He barked orders, demanded everyone stay calm, and paced the gym floor like a caged animal. But his usual steady authority had been cracked wide open. People whispered that his bullets hadn't done a thing, that the flash of the revolver had only revealed the monster, not harmed it. A woman named Claire Morton stood up, insisting the group leave Cold Hollow on foot, no matter where the roads led. "Better to die running than waiting," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Her words stirred others. Arguments broke out, echoing off the walls. Some wanted to head to the church, believing sanctuary still meant something. Others wanted to stay, barricade the gymnasium, and hope daylight offered safety. But nobody mentioned what was becoming increasingly clear. Daylight hadn't saved the others. 8's voices rose. The lanterns dimmed again, not snuffing out this time, but shrinking into pale, trembling points of light. The crowd immediately silenced, eyes darting to the corners of the gym. Something moved in the rafters. The sound was subtle, like cloth dragging against wood, but everyone heard it. A young boy began sobbing, muffled quickly by his mother's hand. The smell of damp pine needles wafted through the gymnasium again. Sheriff Whitaker raised his gun, eyes darting upward, but saw nothing. Then a handful of dust sifted down from the rafters, gray ash, snowing softly onto the gym floor. When one man touched it, he recoiled, claiming it was warm, like embers. That was the moment the group fractured. Fear became stronger than reason. Several townsfolk bolted for the doors, ignoring the sheriff's shouts. They flung them open and sprinted into the night, lantern lights spilling after them. The rest of the group pressed against the walls, too terrified to move, waiting for the inevitable screams. But none came. The runners vanished into the shadows, their footsteps swallowed by the night. The forest outside stood deathly still, the orbs of light no longer visible. For some, that silence was worse than any scream. It meant the dark wasn't finished with them. It was only waiting. The sheriff slammed the gym doors shut and locked them again, his hands trembling. No one spoke after that. They sat in silence, watching the lantern flames shrink lower and lower, listening to the faint, scratching noise above their heads that never seemed to stop. Cold Hollow was no longer just a town in blackout. It had become a cage. And somewhere in the dark rafters above them, something unseen was waiting for the lights to die completely. The 5 who bolted from the gymnasium didn't stop running until the sounds of shouting and crying inside had faded. Their lanterns bounced wildly, beams of light cutting jagged shapes across the cracked pavement. Claire Morton led them, clutching her son Danny's hand so tight his knuckles turned white. Behind her was Robert Kinney, a mechanic with a bad limp, and 2 teenage girls who had been too terrified to stay behind. Their breath steamed in the freezing air, and every so often, each one glanced over their shoulder, convinced the shadows were stretching too close. The woods pressed in on either side of the road, dense walls of blackness alive with whispers. Claire didn't dare stop, though her legs ached and Danny was sobbing. She kept repeating to herself that if they just made it far enough, they'd find help. Headlights, a farmhouse, anything. The road curved sharply, dipping into a hollow, and for a moment they saw lights ahead. Everyone froze. At first, it looked like the soft yellow glow of a house porch. But as they approached, the lights shifted, gliding across the road like search beams. Then they stopped, hung there, dozens of them, suspended between the trees. Not lanterns, not headlights. Eyes, Robert swore under his breath and raised the crowbar he'd been carrying since the blackout began. "Keep moving," Claire whispered harshly, yanking Danny forward. But the boy dug his heels into the pavement, staring at the lights. "They're waving," he said softly. Claire looked harder. The orbs were blinking now, slowly, deliberately, like signals. Left to right to left. A rhythm, a beckoning. One of the teenage girls screamed and bolted off the road into the woods, her lantern bouncing madly before disappearing between the pines. The others shouted after her, but her voice was already gone, cut off as though she'd stepped behind a curtain. Then came the sound. Not footsteps, not branches snapping, something else. A low, guttural groan, rising and falling like a chorus of voices humming in unison. It vibrated in their chests, thick and heavy. The lights swelled brighter, and from between the trees stepped a figure. It was tall, far taller than any man, with impossibly long arms that swayed like pendulums as it moved. Its head tilted to the side in a grotesque angle, studying them with unblinking white orbs that pulsed faintly like lanterns inside its skull. Claire screamed and shoved Danny behind her, while Robert swung the crowbar wildly. The thing didn't flinch. It only leaned forward, lowering its head to the mechanic's height, before the lantern light sputtered out. The last thing Claire saw was Robert's face twisting into terror before he was yanked into the dark. Claire and Danny ran. They didn't know how long, only that their lungs burned and their legs nearly gave out. The two remaining lanterns had gone dark, but somehow they could still see. The trees glowed faintly, as though veins of pale light pulsed within the bark itself. When they finally collapsed in the middle of the road, the silence was suffocating. The other girl was gone. Robert was gone. Only the woods remained, stretching endlessly in every direction. And as Claire clutched Danny to her chest, she realized something far worse than being chased. The road ahead was the exact same road they had already run. The same cracked pavement, the same crooked signpost, the same hollow. Cold Hollow hadn't let them leave at all. The hollow circle inside the gymnasium. The silence had grown unbearable. No one spoke of the people who had run, at least not directly, but every survivor was thinking the same thing. If they had escaped, they would have heard something by now. No shouting, no pounding on the doors, no frantic return. Sheriff Whitaker stood by the entrance, gun lowered at his side, staring at the crack beneath the doors as though expecting something to seep under it. Father Callahan paced in a tight circle, mumbling prayers, while the others sat on the bleachers with hollow eyes. They were no longer a town. They were hostages, waiting for whatever had claimed their neighbors to finish the job. The lanterns burned lower with each passing hour, flames reduced to trembling slivers of light. Everyone flinched whenever the glow shifted, terrified the darkness would swallow them again. Claire Morton's husband, David, who had been separated from her in the chaos, sat with his head in his hands. He hadn't seen her leave with Danny, but the empty space where they had been was enough to hollow him out. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "She's gone, isn't she?" No one answered. Even the sheriff avoided his eyes. The truth was cruel. Whether she was dead, taken, or lost in the woods, Cold Hollow was not giving her back. Outside, Claire and Danny stumbled along the looping road, their breaths visible in the unnaturally cold air. Danny had stopped crying, which unsettled Claire more than his tears. He walked stiffly, staring at the trees with glassy eyes, muttering under his breath. At first she thought he was praying, but then she realized he was repeating words in a rhythm that matched the blinking of the forest lights. Left to right to left. When she grabbed his shoulders and shook him, begging him to stop, he blinked up at her and whispered, "They said we're almost home." Claire's blood ran cold. She hadn't seen a house in miles. Back in the gym, the scratching in the rafters returned, louder this time. Something was up there, something heavy. Dust and bits of wood drifted down, sprinkling onto the heads of the terrified survivors. Sheriff Whitaker aimed his gun toward the ceiling, his hand trembling so badly he could barely hold it steady. The air grew damp and pungent, the smell of soil and rot thick enough to make some gag. Then, with a sudden crack, one of the ceiling beams split, raining ash down on the crowd. People screamed, scrambling over each other to get away from the falling debris. But when they looked up, nothing was there. Only the long, dark void of the rafters staring back. The night stretched on like that, suffocating silence punctured by sudden, maddening noises. In the woods, Claire dragged Danny off the road, determined to hide until daylight. But when dawn finally broke, weak and pale through the trees, her heart nearly stopped. She was back at the gymnasium, not outside it, but facing it from the woods. She could see the cracked windows, the faint lantern glow inside, and the trembling silhouettes of those who had stayed behind. Yet when she called out, her voice carried strangely, muffled as though a wall of glass stood between them. Danny only stared, smiling faintly, whispering, "Told you. We never left." Hollow voices inside the gymnasium. The survivors were unraveling. The air had grown stale, thick with the smell of mildew and rot, as though the walls themselves were decaying. People whispered in hushed, frantic tones, arguing whether to stay or flee. Sheriff Whitaker hadn't spoken in hours, sitting near the door with his revolver slack in his lap. His face was pale, jaw clenched, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Father Callahan stood at the center of the room, clutching his crucifix with white knuckles, chanting louder and louder as though trying to drown out the dread clawing at everyone's thoughts. But the prayers were broken by a sound none of them could explain: voices. Dozens of them, drifting through the gym walls. Faint, overlapping, too many to separate. Some swore the voices were calling their names. Claire pressed Danny against her chest as they crouched in the trees, staring at the gym across the clearing. She wanted to run to the doors, bang on them, scream until someone let her in. But Danny had grown heavier in her arms, not from weight, but from stillness. His body felt rigid, like something inside him had locked up. His lips moved in that same pattern, left to right to left, and she realized with horror that the rhythm wasn't random. It matched the blinking lights in the trees. She slapped his cheek lightly, whispering for him to wake up, to stop. His eyes finally met hers, but they weren't the soft, frightened eyes of her son anymore. They glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting something that wasn't there. He smiled, whispering, "They're almost here." The gymnasium lights dimmed again, flickering down to embers. This time, they didn't return. A knock rattled the steel doors, 3 slow, deliberate strikes, just as before. The crowd shrieked, pressing back against the bleachers. Sheriff Whitaker stumbled to his feet, raising his revolver, but the knocks continued, growing louder, sharper, until the metal buckled inward with each blow. Something massive pressed from the other side, denting the steel as though it were paper. The voices grew clearer now, low, guttural chants rising in unison, vibrating the floorboards beneath their feet. Father Callahan raised his crucifix and screamed the Lord's Prayer at the top of his lungs. The door bent again, a crack splitting down the center. Outside, Claire staggered backward, clutching Danny's shoulders. "We have to run," she begged, but Danny only lifted his hand and pointed toward the gym. His finger trembled, not with fear, but with certainty. "They're waiting," he said, "for us." And then she saw it, movement in the clearing. Figures stepping out of the trees, tall and gaunt, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. Their eyes glowed with the same pulsing light as the orbs, and their heads tilted in unison as if listening to a silent command. They didn't rush. They simply walked, deliberate and sure, toward the gymnasium. The first steel door finally snapped inward with a deafening clang. The lanterns sputtered back to life at that exact moment, illuminating the entrance in pale, flickering light. The survivors stared, frozen, as a shadow taller than the doorframe stepped inside. Its head scraped the ceiling, long arms dangling nearly to the floor. For the first time, the townsfolk saw it clearly, skin gray and slick like wet bark, a face stretched too thin, with hollow sockets that pulsed with pale light. It did not speak. It only leaned forward, inhaling deeply, as if savoring their fear. Then the voices outside rose into a chilling chorus, and the gym was no longer their refuge. It was their cage. The breathing darkness, the gymnasium erupted in screams as the creatures stepped fully inside. The lanterns trembled in their glass casings, their flames bending inward as though sucked toward the figure. Its long arms unfolded like wings, joints cracking in grotesque rhythm. Sheriff Whitaker fired 3 shots into its chest. Each bullet landed with a sickening thud, but the thing didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it tilted its head back, releasing a guttural exhale that rolled across the gym like a wave of thunder. The sound wasn't just heard. It was felt, deep in the lungs of every terrified soul inside. One by one, people clutched their chests, choking as the air seemed to thicken into something wet and heavy. Father Callahan lunged forward, holding the crucifix high. His voice cracked as he screamed verses, but the words warped in the air, melting into meaningless echoes. The creature leaned close, its eyeless face inches from his, and inhaled sharply. Callahan's scream cut off mid-breath. His body stiffened, and then his skin began to flake away like burning paper. Within seconds, nothing but a pile of gray ash remained where he had stood. The crowd collapsed into chaos, scrambling over each other, clawing toward the exits. But more shadows pressed in from the splintered doorway. Dozens of them. Each one ducked under the frame, filling the gym with a living wall of gray, towering figures. Outside, Claire watched in mute horror, her nails digging into Danny's shoulders. She could see the silhouettes writhing inside the gym windows, could hear the screams piercing the night air, but Danny stood eerily calm. "They're taking them back," he whispered. His words chilled her blood. "Back where?" she demanded, shaking him. But Danny only pointed toward the forest, where the lights blinked steadily in a circle as though marking a boundary. The ground beneath her feet vibrated faintly, like something vast and hollow was breathing just below the soil. Inside, Sheriff Whitaker rallied what courage he had left. He screamed for the survivors to move, firing round after round until his revolver clicked empty. The flashes revealed scenes of terror, people dragged into the rafters by unseen hands, others collapsing into ash mid-step, the floor itself darkening with damp patches of soil that hadn't been there before. He hurled the useless gun and charged the nearest figure, fists clenched. It caught him effortlessly, skeletal fingers wrapping around his chest, and lifted him into the air like a child's toy. For a moment he thrashed, face red with fury and terror. Then the creature exhaled, and his body collapsed into dust, scattering across the crowd. Claire couldn't look away. Through the cracked window, she saw the sheriff's ashes drift like smoke, joining the haze above the gym floor. Her son tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "It's almost over." She spun him around, gripping his small face. His eyes glowed brighter now, and his voice was no longer just his own. There were others layered beneath it, dozens speaking in chorus through his lips. "We have to go to the circle, Mom," Danny said softly. "That's where they're waiting for us." And behind him, deeper in the forest, the ring of lights pulsed like a living heartbeat, beckoning them both closer. The circle of the forest closed in tighter as Claire followed Danny toward the lights. The trees no longer looked like pines but like pillars, their bark slick and pulsing faintly as if veins ran beneath it. The air grew colder with every step, each breath searing her lungs. Danny moved with eerie certainty, his small figure walking ahead without hesitation, lantern glow reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. Claire whispered for him to stop, to turn back, but her words seemed to vanish as soon as they left her mouth. Even her footsteps felt muffled, like she was sinking deeper into a place where sound didn't belong. The circle appeared suddenly. In a clearing ringed by trees that bent inward unnaturally, dozens of glowing orbs hovered just above the ground, each one pulsating in rhythm like a heartbeat. The soil inside the circle was wrong, soft and black, as if churned by countless hands. At its center yawned a hole, perfectly round, wide enough for a house to fall through. From it came the sound she had felt before, a deep, steady inhale and exhale. The ground rose and fell with each breath, and the lights blinked in time with it. Claire staggered to the edge, clutching Danny's shoulders, her stomach twisting. It wasn't a pit. It was a mouth. Figures stood around the circle, dozens of them. The hollow men, tall and skeletal, their heads tilted in eerie unison, arms swaying like pendulums. Their glowing sockets blinked with the same rhythm as the orbs, synchronized to the breathing earth. One of them stepped forward, lowering its head toward Danny. Instead of recoiling, her son stepped closer, smiling faintly. "They're family," he whispered, his voice now layered with dozens of tones. Claire's heart hammered. "No, Danny, they're not," she pleaded, dragging him back. But his small hands were ice cold, unyielding. "They've been waiting for us," he said. The earth groaned. A gust of wind roared from the pit, scattering soil and ash into the air. For an instant, Claire saw faces in the dirt, dozens of them, screaming silently, their eyes wide and hollow. She recognized some neighbors, friends, people from the gym. Their bodies weren't gone. They were part of this thing. She screamed Danny's name, but the hollow men shifted, parting to create a path toward the pit. The boy took a step forward, drawn by a force stronger than her grip. Claire clawed at his arms, tears streaming down her face, but he moved like a sleepwalker, as though her strength no longer mattered. Then, the voice came, not spoken aloud, but inside her skull, vibrating through her teeth, her bones. The hollow is never empty. It remembers. It takes. It keeps. The words were not one voice, but thousands, layered and endless. Claire fell to her knees, clutching her head, sobbing in raw terror. The hollow men swayed closer, their arms lowering as though to usher Danny forward. And as the pit's breath deepened, pulling the air itself toward its dark throat, Claire realized the truth. This wasn't just Cold Hollow. It was the hollow itself. The town was nothing but its skin. The hollow remembers Claire's nails dug into Danny's shoulders as the pull toward the pit grew stronger. The hollow men swayed, their long arms lowering like a priest's blessing, urging the boy forward. She screamed his name, voice raw, but he only turned to her with a calm smile. His eyes glowed bright now, no longer human, and his small lips moved in perfect rhythm with the pulsing orbs, left to right, right to left. She yanked with all her strength, dragging him back a step, but the ground beneath her feet softened, sucking at her boots like wet sand. The earth wanted her too. The pit exhaled. A hot gust blew her hair across her face, carrying with it the stench of rot and pine sap. The faces in the soil shifted again. Neighbors, friends, people she had shared dinners and church pews with, all fused into the breathing earth. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes hollow voids that blinked with the rhythm of the lights. One of them was Sheriff Whitaker, his jaw locked open as if mid-yell, his form collapsing back into dirt as quickly as it appeared. Claire gagged, her body shaking, but she refused to let go of Danny. "You're my son," she cried, tears streaking her cheeks. "You're mine, not theirs." For the first time, Danny hesitated. His glowing eyes flickered, confusion breaking through the trance. Claire seized it, pressing her forehead against his. "Remember your room, Danny," she whispered. "The nightlight, the blanket with the trains on it. Remember me, please." His small body trembled, torn between her voice and the pull of the hollow. But the ground rumbled violently, the pit inhaling with such force that Claire felt her chest collapse inward. The hollow men leaned closer, their eyeless sockets blazing, their long fingers brushing the air as if ready to snatch them both. The earth's voice thundered inside her skull. "The hollow takes what is given. The hollow keeps what is taken." With a scream that tore her throat raw, Claire shoved Danny backward with all the strength she had left. The boy stumbled out of the circle, collapsing onto the forest floor. For a moment, his eyes dimmed, his body limp as though freed from the trance. Relief surged through her, but too late. The ground beneath Claire split open, soil crumbling as the pit yawned wider. Cold, skeletal hands shot up from the dirt, grasping her arms, her waist, her throat. She clawed and kicked, shrieking Danny's name, but the pull was unstoppable. The hollow had accepted her offering. The last thing she saw was her son's face returning to human, wide, terrified, screaming for her. Before she was dragged into the breathing earth, her cry cut off in choking silence. The pit closed as quickly as it had opened. The hollow men swayed one final time, their glowing sockets dimming as they melted back into the treeline. The orbs vanished. The forest went still. Danny lay alone at the edge of the circle, sobbing into the soil, his small hands clutching at the dirt where his mother had been. When dawn broke, pale and lifeless, Cold Hollow was silent. The gymnasium stood empty, its windows shattered, its floors covered in ash. Houses lay abandoned, meals rotted on tables, doors ajar. The town was gone, swallowed. All except for one boy, who wandered out of the woods alone. Danny. His eyes no longer glowed, but deep within them, something lingered. The rhythm remained. Left to right, right to left. The hollow remembers, and it waits.